Top 1. The Agatti Relics. In November 2013, a research team working off the northwestern coast of Sicily brought to the surface a collection of bronze battering rams, corroded helmets, and fractured weapon fragments from a depth of 100 meters. The artifacts were not randomly scattered. They formed a concentrated field across the seabed, aligned in patterns that suggested intentional positioning during combat. Carbon dating and material analysis confirmed what historical records had long suggested but never proven. These were the physical remnants of the Battle of the Agatti Islands, fought in 241 BC between Rome and Carthage. It was the final engagement of the First Punic War, and until this discovery, it existed only in written accounts. No battlefield had ever been found. No wreckage had been confirmed. For over 2,000 years, the location remained theoretical. The discovery should have been straightforward. Ancient naval battles leave debris. Ships sink. Metal corrodes. Wood disintegrates. What the archaeologists found, however, did not align with expectations. The bronze rams, which were mounted on the prows of warships to pierce enemy hulls, were recovered in nearly perfect geometric arrangement despite being submerged for more than 2 millennia. They had not drifted with currents, nor had they been displaced by seismic activity. They remained fixed in place as though the battle had paused mid-strike, and the ocean floor had simply accepted them without disturbance. Marine geologists examined the site and found no evidence of sediment buildup that would naturally anchor such objects. The seabed in that region is known for strong undercurrents. Yet the rams had not moved. Further analysis revealed another inconsistency. Several of the helmets bore impact marks that did not correspond to known Roman or Carthaginian weaponry of the period. The dents were too uniform, too deep, and struck at angles that would have required tools or force not documented in any contemporary source. Metallurgists who examined the bronze composition found trace elements that do not appear in other artifacts from the same era. The origin of these elements remains unidentified. When researchers attempted to recreate the alloy using period-appropriate methods, they could not replicate the exact structure. Historical records state that up to 50 Carthaginian ships were destroyed and 10,000 men perished in the battle. Roman forces were said to have trapped the Carthaginian fleet, cutting off their route and sinking them in a decisive strike. Yet no human remains were recovered from the site. Not a single bone fragment, no personal effects beyond military hardware. Nothing to indicate the presence of the thousands who allegedly died there. Oceanographers noted that while organic material degrades, bone and certain textiles can survive in deep, low-oxygen environments for millennia. The absence is unexplained. In 2015, the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage restricted further exploration of the site. No official explanation was provided. The artifacts were placed in controlled storage, and requests for independent analysis have been declined. One researcher involved in the initial recovery described the site as archaeologically sterile beyond the metal. If 10,000 men died there, the ocean kept no record of them. Only the weapons remain. Top 2. The Sealed Remedy. A laboratory in Rome received 5 small circular tablets extracted from a corroded tin vessel recovered decades earlier from the Relito del Pacino, a Roman cargo ship that sank off the coast of Tuscany approximately 2,000 years ago. The vessel had been excavated throughout the 1980s and 90s near the ruins of a major trade hub connecting the eastern and western Mediterranean. Among the cargo were Syrian glass bowls, bronze jugs, ceramic amphorae, and a wooden medicine chest containing surgical instruments, a mortar, 136 drug vials, and several cylindrical tin containers. One of those containers had remained completely sealed. When opened, it held 5 medicinal pills, perfectly preserved and still intact after 2 millennia submerged in seawater. Chemical analysis identified zinc compounds, iron oxide, starch, beeswax, pine resin, and traces of plant-derived organic matter. Based on their composition and shape, researchers concluded the tablets were likely used to treat eye infections or inflammation. The findings were published and filed as a remarkable but explainable discovery. Ancient pharmacology was more advanced than previously assumed. The story should have ended there. It did not. What the published report did not emphasize was the condition of the pills themselves. They were not degraded. They were not partially dissolved or compromised by moisture. Despite being stored in a wooden chest inside a shipwreck, submerged in salt water for 2,000 years, the tablet showed no signs of water infiltration. The tin vessel had remained sealed, yes, but tin corrodes. Salt water is corrosive. The chest was made of wood, a porous organic material. Yet when the container was opened, the pills were dry, not damp, not crumbling, dry, as if they had been stored in a climate-controlled archive. Marine archaeologists who examined the wreck noted another irregularity. The medicine chest was located in a section of the ship that had sustained structural damage during the sinking. Water should have entered. The wood should have rotted and collapsed within decades, if not sooner. Other organic materials in the same cargo hold, including rope, fabric, and food stores, had disintegrated entirely. But the medicine chest and its contents had not. When conservators attempted to explain the preservation, they attributed it to unusual sealing and favorable microenvironment conditions. Neither term appears in standard archaeological literature. No comparable example of such preservation has been documented in any other Mediterranean shipwreck. Further analysis of the zinc compounds revealed concentrations inconsistent with known Roman mining operations. Zinc extraction in the ancient world was rudimentary. The levels found in the tablets suggest a refining process that would not be developed for another 1,500 years. When modern chemists attempted to recreate the formula using ancient methods, they could not achieve the same purity or stability. One researcher described the tablets as chemically advanced beyond the technological capacity of the period. The pills have since been placed in restricted storage. Requests for independent testing have been denied. The official explanation remains that they are simply well-preserved Roman medicine. But preservation does not account for impossible chemistry. The Romans may have known how to treat eye disease. They did not know how to stop time inside a shipwreck. Top 3. The stitched vessel. In March 2014, marine archaeologist Julia Boedo from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique announced the recovery of a wooden boat from Zambrtija Cove on the northern coast of Croatia. Carbon dating placed the wreck at approximately 1200 BC, making it over 3,000 years old. The vessel measured 7 meters in length and 2.5 meters in width. It was identified as a sewn boat, a Bronze Age construction method in which wooden planks are bound together, using organic cordage rather than metal fasteners or pegs. The technique was known to have been used in the Adriatic region until the Roman period, though few examples have survived. What made this discovery unusual was not the design or the age. It was the condition. The boat was recovered from shallow coastal waters where sediment accumulation is minimal and tidal movement is constant. Under these conditions, organic material typically degrades within centuries. Wood splits, fibers separate, and structural integrity collapses. Yet the Zambrtija boat remained largely intact. The stitching made from plant-based cordage was still visible along several seams. The wooden frame had not warped or fragmented. Tree ring analysis identified the hull as composed of elm, alder, and fir, species that do not naturally resist prolonged submersion. When the samples were examined, researchers found no evidence of the microbial degradation or fungal colonization that should have been present after 3 millennia underwater. Bodo and her team conducted a detailed structural assessment. They found that the planks had been sewn together with remarkable precision using a consistent stitch pattern that required both skill and time. The cordage had not rotted. It had not loosened. In some sections, it remained taut as though the boat had been constructed recently and simply placed in the water. Marine biologists who inspected the wreck noted the absence of barnacle scarring, coral encrustation, or mollusk boring, all of which are inevitable on submerged wood in the Adriatic. The surface of the hull was clean, not pristine, but far cleaner than it should have been. Conservators attempted to explain the preservation by suggesting the wreck had been buried under protective sediment for most of its submersion. However, sediment analysis showed no long-term coverage. The boat had been exposed to seawater for the majority of its time underwater. A secondary theory proposed that low oxygen levels in the cove had slowed decomposition. Oxygen readings taken at the site were within normal range. No anoxic layer was detected. In 2015, Boedo's team announced plans to create a full 3-dimensional model of the vessel and eventually a complete reconstruction. Dendrochronology was underway to determine the exact year the trees were felled. The results were expected within months. They were never published. The reconstruction project was quietly shelved in 2016. No explanation was provided. Requests to view the wreck or access the analysis data have been referred to the Croatian Ministry of Culture, which has not responded. One member of the original research team, speaking off record, described the wood as structurally inconsistent with known decay rates. When asked to clarify, they said only that the boat should not exist in the condition it was found. Bronze Age shipbuilding is well understood. Wood decomposition is well understood. What is not understood is how a 3,000-year-old boat can emerge from the sea as if it had been submerged for decades, not millennia. Top 4. The cenote skulls. In 2014, a team of underwater archaeologists descended into Sacuam, a flooded sinkhole in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, approximately 15 kilometers from the village of Tecom. Cenotes are natural limestone sinkholes that expose underground water systems, and many were used by the ancient Maya for ritual purposes. Local residents had long avoided Sacuam, claiming it was guarded by a feathered serpent with the head of a horse. Villagers described seeing the creature perched in trees near the cenote's edge, leaping upward, spinning 3 times in midair, and plunging into the water. The archaeologists dismissed the accounts as folklore. On the first dive, they found something that made them reconsider. At a depth of 30 meters, scattered across the limestone floor, were more than a dozen human skeletons. The bones were disarticulated, separated from one another, but not widely dispersed. They lay in loose clusters, as though the bodies had been placed rather than discarded. What immediately drew attention were the skulls. Every skull recovered from the site displayed extreme cranial elongation. The foreheads had been artificially flattened, and the rear of the skulls stretched upward, a deliberate modification performed during infancy by binding the head with boards or cloth. The practice is documented among several Mesoamerican cultures, though its purpose remains disputed. Status, beauty, religious significance. Theories exist, but no consensus. What was unusual here was the uniformity. Every individual at the site had undergone the same modification. No normal skulls were found. The bones showed no signs of trauma, no cut marks, no fractures, no evidence of violence or sacrifice. Cause of death could not be determined. The skeletons were not buried. They had been submerged, but there were no grave goods, no offerings, no ceremonial markers. In other cenotes used for sacrifice, archaeologists have found jade, pottery, incense burners, and remains showing clear signs of ritual killing. Sacuam contained none of this. Just bones, just skulls, just water. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains between 800 and 1000 AD. During the terminal classic period of Maya civilization, this was a time of widespread societal collapse across the region. Cities were abandoned, trade networks fractured, and populations disappeared. The reasons are still debated: drought, warfare, environmental degradation. But mass death was common. What was not common was the selective deposition of modified individuals in a cenote with no accompanying ritual context. Geological surveys of the cenote revealed another anomaly. The limestone walls bore no tool marks, no evidence of human excavation or modification. Yet the entrance to the underwater chamber was narrow, less than a meter wide, and required navigating a vertical shaft before opening into the main cavern. Transporting bodies into such a space would have been difficult, especially in a pre-industrial context. The effort required does not match the absence of ceremony. If these people were important enough to modify an infancy and transport into a cenote, why were they not honored in death? One archaeologist involved in the excavation noted that the bones had an unusual weight. They were denser than expected, heavier than typical Maya remains from the same period. Bone density analysis was conducted, but results were never published. The site was closed to further exploration in 2015. The Yucatan Ministry of Culture cited preservation concerns and prohibited additional dives. The skeletons were transferred to a storage facility in Merida. Requests to study them have been declined. The villagers still speak of the serpent. They say it does not guard the cenote. It waits inside it. Top 5. The Baltic Cache. In March 2014, a team of divers working off the coast of southern Sweden, near the island of Having in the Baltic Sea, discovered a collection of Stone Age artifacts resting on the seabed at a depth of 16 meters. The objects included flint tools, carved wooden implements, animal bone fragments, and pieces of worked antler. Radiocarbon analysis dated the materials to approximately 11,000 years ago, placing them in the early Mesolithic period, shortly after the last ice age. The items were identified as remnants of nomadic Scandinavian hunter-gatherers who would have occupied the region when sea levels were significantly lower and the Baltic was not yet fully formed. The discovery itself was remarkable. What followed was inexplicable. The artifacts were found embedded in gytja, a thick, organic-rich sediment that accumulates at the bottom of eutrophic bodies of water. Gytja is anaerobic, meaning it contains little to no oxygen, which can preserve organic material for extended periods. Wood, bone, and plant fibers that would normally decompose within decades can survive for millennia under such conditions. The Swedish team attributed the preservation to this environment, but gytja formation takes time. It accumulates gradually, layer by layer, as organic matter decays and settles. For objects to be buried in gytja, they must remain stationary long enough for sediment to cover them. The Baltic seabed in that area is subject to strong currents and periodic storm disturbances. Objects left on the surface do not stay in place. They drift, tumble, or are buried unevenly. Yet the artifacts were found in a tight cluster, aligned in a pattern that suggested intentional arrangement, not random discard. The carved wooden tools were the most perplexing. Wood recovered from underwater archaeological sites of this age is typically waterlogged, brittle, and darkened by centuries of submersion. The halving pieces were none of these things. They were solid, structurally intact, and retained visible tool marks along their edges. When dendrochronologists examined the wood cells under magnification, they found no collapse of the cellular structure, no expansion from water absorption, and no microbial degradation. One researcher described the material as dimensionally stable, a term used for freshly worked wood, not relics submerged for 11 millennia. The flint tools presented another problem. Flint does not degrade underwater, but it does accumulate surface deposits, calcium carbonate crusts, algae films, and mineral staining. The halving flints were clean, not polished, but absent of the accretions that form on submerged stone over thousands of years. Marine geologists examined the sediment around the tools and confirmed prolonged exposure to seawater. The chemical signature of the surrounding environment was consistent with long-term submersion. The tools themselves did not reflect this. In 2016, the research team attempted to date the gytja layer directly. Standard sediment chronology suggested the layer had formed no earlier than 8,000 years ago, roughly 3,000 years after the artifacts were supposedly deposited. The objects were older than the sediment that preserved them. When confronted with this inconsistency, the lead archaeologist suggested that the artifacts had been redeposited by natural forces and only later became embedded in gytja. No mechanism for such redeposition was proposed. Currents strong enough to move stone and wood across the seabed would not place them in neat, organized clusters. The collection was transferred to the Swedish National Heritage Board for further study. In 2017, access to the artifacts was restricted. No official reason was given. A planned exhibition at the Historical Museum in Stockholm was canceled without explanation. One museum curator, speaking anonymously, stated that the items do not conform to expected preservation models and that their display would raise questions the institution is not prepared to answer. The objects remain in storage. The site has not been revisited. If Stone Age Swedes left these tools behind, they did so in a way that defies every known principle of underwater archaeology. Top 6. The Yonaguni Formation. In the spring of 1995, a dive instructor named Kihachiro Arataki was exploring the waters off the southern coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost inhabited island of Japan, when he encountered a massive stone structure rising from the seabed at a depth of 25 meters. The formation consisted of enormous rectangular blocks stacked and aligned in what appeared to be terrace levels. Sharp right angles connected flat surfaces. Linear grooves ran parallel across the stone. There were features that resembled steps, platforms, and corridors. Arataki reported the discovery to Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, who began a systematic survey of the site. Over the following years, the structure was mapped, photographed, and analyzed. What emerged was not a single anomaly, but an extensive complex spanning over 300 meters. The debate that followed has never been resolved. Proponents of artificial origin point to the precision of the angles. Natural erosion does not typically produce 90-degree corners. Water and wave action round edges, fracture stone along weak points, and create irregular surfaces. The Yonaguni blocks display none of this. The terraces are flat and the edges are sharp. In several locations, stone channels run in straight lines for over 10 meters without deviation. There are features that resemble staircases with evenly spaced steps carved into vertical walls. In one section, two parallel grooves form a pathway approximately 2 meters wide, bordered on both sides by raised stone borders. If these are natural formations, they represent an extraordinary concentration of geometric regularity in a relatively small area. Geological analysis revealed that the stone is sandstone, a sedimentary rock that can fracture along bedding planes when subjected to tectonic stress. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, examined the site in 1997 and concluded that the features were the result of natural weathering and tectonic activity. Sandstone in that region is known to split into blocky shapes when faulted. Schoch argued that the right angles and flat surfaces were simply well-preserved examples of natural jointing. His assessment was published and widely cited. What it did not address were the carvings. In multiple locations across the formation, researchers have documented markings that do not correspond to natural erosion patterns. One stone face displays a series of parallel grooves, each approximately 5 centimeters deep and spaced at regular intervals. Another section contains what appears to be a carved symbol, roughly circular in shape, with radiating lines extending outward. Schoch acknowledged these features, but described them as ambiguous and did not include them in his final report. Marine archaeologists who studied the same markings found them inconsistent with known natural processes. One stated plainly, erosion does not carve circles. Radiocarbon dating of coral and marine organisms attached to the structure suggests it has been submerged for at least 10,000 years, a timeline that places it at the end of the last ice age. If the formation is artificial, it would predate the earliest known monumental architecture by several millennia. No tools have been found, no pottery, no evidence of habitation, and no organic material that would indicate human activity. The structure exists in isolation. No similar formations have been discovered anywhere in the surrounding waters. In 2001, the Japanese Agency for Cultural Affairs reviewed the evidence and declined to designate the site as an archaeological monument. The reasoning was not made public. Kimura continued to advocate for recognition, presenting surveys, photographs, and measurements. His requests were not addressed. The site remains classified as a natural formation by the Japanese government despite the fact that no comprehensive geological model has been published to explain its features. Yonaguni sits on the edge of a tectonic plate boundary. Earthquakes are frequent. The island has been submerged and re-emerged multiple times over millennia. If the formation is natural, it is geology that looks like architecture. If it is artificial, it is architecture that has no origin. Top 7. The Phantom City. In June 2013, the Greek Underwater Antiquities Department announced the discovery of what appeared to be an ancient submerged settlement in the Gulf of Alakanos off the coast of Zakynthos in western Greece. Divers had documented extensive structural remains at a depth of between 2 and 5 meters, including large rectangular formations resembling building foundations, sections of what looked like cobblestone paving, and most notably, 20 circular stone bases, each featuring a precisely carved central depression measuring 34 centimeters in diameter. The bases were evenly spaced and aligned, suggesting they had once supported wooden pillars. Initial assessments by the Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities described the site as a major public building, possibly part of an ancient port settlement dating back over 2,000 years. Photographs were released. Plans for excavation were announced. The discovery was celebrated as a significant addition to Greek archaeological heritage. 6 months later, it was declared not to exist. In December 2013, a study published by a team of geologists from the University of Athens concluded that the formations were entirely natural. the product of a geological process involving methane seepage and mineral precipitation. According to the study, bacteria in the seabed consume methane gas escaping from underground reservoirs, and the byproduct of this biological activity causes dissolved minerals in the water to solidify into calcium carbonate concretions. Over time, these concretions can take on unusual shapes, including cylindrical forms and flat disc-like structures. The circular stone bases, the study argued, were simply hardened mineral deposits formed around methane vents. The rectangular foundations were coincidentally shaped sediment formations. The paving stones were natural rock fractures. The entire site, they concluded, was a fortunate alignment of geological accidents. The explanation was accepted by the Greek Ministry of Culture. The site was removed from the archaeological registry. No further dives were authorized. Media coverage shifted from celebrating a lost city to praising the rigor of scientific skepticism. The story should have ended there. It did not, because the geology does not explain the geometry. Methane seep structures are well documented in marine environments. They form irregularly. They cluster around gas vents in chaotic, organic patterns. They do not align in rows. They do not maintain uniform dimensions. Yet the Zakynthos bases were uniform. Each circular depression measured 34 centimeters across within a margin of less than 2 centimeters. The spacing between them was consistent, averaging just over 3 meters. If these were natural formations, they represent a level of symmetry unheard of in seep-related geology. One marine geologist, not involved in the original study, reviewed the published measurements and described the uniformity as statistically improbable for a natural process. The cobblestone paving presented another problem. The stones were flat, angular, and fitted together in a tessellated pattern. Calcium carbonate concretions do not form flat-topped polygonal shapes. They build up in mounds, nodules, or irregular crusts. The supposed paving stones had sharp edges and interlocking boundaries. When confronted with this, the authors of the geological study suggested that the stones were simply fractured bedrock weathered into angular pieces by wave action. But the seabed at the site is not bedrock. It is sediment. Fractured bedrock does not exist there. Requests to revisit the site have been denied. The Ephorate of Underwater Antiquities, which initially championed the discovery, has not issued further statements. Photographs of the circular bases remain in the public record, but no independent analysis of the stones themselves has been permitted. One archaeologist involved in the initial survey resigned shortly after the site was reclassified. In a private correspondence later made public, they wrote, "We were told what to conclude before we finished looking. If the Zakynthos structures are natural, they are the most orderly natural formations ever found in the Mediterranean. If they are artificial, an entire ancient settlement has been dismissed on the basis of a single geological report. Either way, something is being ignored." Top 8. The drowned metropolis. In February 2014, Chinese officials authorized a series of exploratory dives into Qiandao Lake in Zhejiang province to assess the condition of Xucheng, an ancient city deliberately flooded in 1959 during the construction of the Shinan River hydroelectric dam. The city, known historically as the Lion City due to its location at the base of Wushi Mountain or Five Lion Mountain, had been submerged for over 50 years. Decay was expected. Structural collapse, silt accumulation, erosion of wooden beams, and disintegration of masonry are standard outcomes for prolonged underwater submersion. What the dive teams found defied every projection. The city had not decayed. It had not collapsed. It was intact. The streets were still paved. The wooden door frames were still standing. The stone archways that marked the entrances to residential districts were undamaged, with carvings still sharp enough to read. Temple facades retained their painted inscriptions. Interior walls bore murals undisturbed by water or algae. In the central plaza, stone sculptures of lions stood exactly where they had been placed centuries earlier. Not toppled, not fragmented, and not encrusted with the biofouling that covers every submerged surface within years of immersion. The entire city looked as though it had been submerged days ago, not decades. Xucheng was founded during the Eastern Han Dynasty nearly 1,800 years ago and had been continuously inhabited until its evacuation in 1959. The architecture reflected multiple periods, from Ming Dynasty gates to Qing-era residential complexes. Wood, stone, brick, and plaster are all materials known to degrade rapidly underwater. Wood swells, softens, and disintegrates. Plaster dissolves. Brick crumbles. Yet the buildings of Shicheng showed none of this. Wooden beams were solid. Plaster walls were smooth. Brick structures displayed no cracking or spalling. Conservators brought in to assess the site found no microbial activity, no rot, and no structural compromise of any kind. The water in Qiandao Lake is not anoxic. Oxygen levels are normal for a freshwater reservoir. The temperature fluctuates seasonally. The lake is not stagnant. These are not conditions that preserve organic material. In comparable submerged sites, such as the flooded towns of Europe's reservoir systems, wood typically fails within 20 years. Shicheng had been underwater for over half a century, yet its infrastructure remained as stable as the day it was flooded. One structural engineer reviewing the dive footage stated plainly, "This should not be possible." Further investigation revealed another anomaly. The city had no silt. Qiandao Lake is fed by rivers carrying sediment from the surrounding mountains. Submerged structures in the lake accumulate thick layers of fine particulate matter within years. Shicheng streets were clear. The interiors of buildings were free of sediment. Doorways, windowsills, and courtyards showed no accumulation. It was as if the water moved through the city but left nothing behind. Hydrologists could not explain the absence. Currents in the lake are not strong enough to sweep sediment away continuously. The city sits in a low-lying basin where deposition should be heaviest. In 2015, the Chinese government approved a limited tourism initiative allowing certified divers to visit specific sections of the city under strict supervision. Photographs and video from these dives circulated internationally. Archaeological journals noted the preservation, but offered no explanation. Comparisons to other submerged cities were made, and none matched the condition of Shicheng. One marine archaeologist wrote, "We are looking at a preservation event, not a preservation environment." In 2017, access was restricted. Tourism permits were revoked without explanation. Official statements cited conservation concerns, though no deterioration had been observed. Scientists who had been granted research access reported that their permits were not renewed. Data from sonar surveys conducted in 2016 was classified by the Zhejiang Provincial Department of Culture. Requests for publication were denied. Shicheng remains submerged. It remains intact, and no one has explained how a city flooded in 1959 can look like it was flooded yesterday. Top 9. The mapped ruins. In 1967, a geologist surveying the coastline near the village of Pavlopetri in southern Greece noticed geometric patterns visible through shallow water offshore. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the presence of rectilinear structures extending across the seabed at a depth of approximately 4 meters. Subsequent underwater surveys identified a complete Bronze Age settlement with streets, building foundations, courtyards, and what appeared to be a central plaza. Ceramic fragments recovered from the site dated the city to at least 2800 BC, making it one of the oldest submerged urban centers ever discovered. The layout was astonishingly clear. Roads intersected at right angles. Houses were organized into blocks. A water management system, including channels and terracotta piping, was still identifiable. The city had not eroded into rubble. It had simply sunk and stayed exactly where it fell. Pavlopetri is believed to have been submerged around 1000 BC, likely due to seismic activity. The Peloponnese sits on a tectonically active fault line, and earthquakes have repeatedly altered the coastline over millennia. Subsidence, the gradual sinking of land, is well documented in the region. What is not well documented is the preservation of urban infrastructure after nearly 3,000 years underwater. Stone degrades, foundations shift, and silt buries everything. Yet Pavlopetri remained legible, not partially visible, but mapped with precision. In 2009, a team led by John Henderson from the University of Nottingham conducted a comprehensive survey using sonar imaging and photogrammetry. They documented over 15 distinct building structures, some with as many as 12 interior rooms. The central plaza measured 40 meters by 20 meters, bordered by what appeared to be public or administrative buildings. Roads connected residential areas to the plaza and extended outward toward the perimeter of the settlement. The water management system was traced across multiple blocks, with ceramic pipes still embedded in their original positions. Henderson's team produced a detailed three-dimensional reconstruction of the city based on the underwater survey. The model was remarkably complete, far more complete than it should have been. Most submerged sites lose definition over time. Walls collapse, streets fill with sediment, organic materials vanish, and what remains is a scatter of stone and ceramic shards that must be interpreted through excavation and analysis. Pavlopetre did not require interpretation. The city plan was visible from the surface. Divers could swim down the streets. The walls, though reduced to foundations, still outlined rooms, doorways, and corridors. One archaeologist described it as architecturally frozen. Another noted that the level of preservation does not align with expected degradation over 3 millennia. Marine geologists examined the site to determine why it had remained so intact. The seabed in that area is sandy, not rocky. Structures built on sand typically settle unevenly and fracture as the substrate shifts. Pavlopetre's buildings had not shifted. The streets had not buckled. The plaza had not sunken into the seabed. The entire city rested on the surface of the sand as though it had been carefully placed there. No subsurface anchoring was found. No bedrock foundation, just sand. One engineer reviewing the survey data stated, "Cities do not sit on sand for 3,000 years without sinking into it." The ceramics told another story. Pottery fragments scattered across the site were analyzed and found to be in unusually good condition. Ceramic is durable, but prolonged exposure to salt water typically results in surface pitting in mineral deposits. The Pavlo-Petri ceramics were clean. Some still bore painted decoration. One storage jar, recovered intact, contained residue that was chemically analyzed and identified as olive oil. The oil had not fully degraded. Organic chemists were baffled. Olive oil does not survive underwater for thousands of years. In 2011, the Greek government restricted access to the site. Further dives required special permits, which were rarely granted. Henderson's team was allowed one additional survey in 2012, after which their access was revoked. No explanation was provided. The three-dimensional model of Pavlopetri was published in archaeological journals, but raw data from the surveys was never released. Requests for sonar files and photogrammetric datasets were denied. Pavlopetri exists. Its streets can be traced on sonar. Its buildings can be photographed. But no explanation has been offered for why a city that sank 3,000 years ago looks like it sank 300. Top 10. The Temple City. In 2001, French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio was conducting a survey in Aboukir Bay off the northern coast of Egypt, searching for remnants of Napoleon's fleet destroyed during the Battle of the Nile in 1798. His team was using side-scan sonar and magnetometry to map the seafloor when they detected a massive concentration of anomalies spread across several square kilometers at a depth of roughly 7 meters. Initial dives revealed not warships, but stone, carved, inscribed, and impossibly large. What emerged over the following months was not debris, it was a city. Heraklion, the legendary port thought by many scholars to be a symbolic or exaggerated reference in ancient texts, was real, and it had been underwater for 12 centuries. According to historical records, Heraklion was Egypt's primary Mediterranean gateway before the founding of Alexandria in 331 BC. It was a religious and economic center, home to the Grand Temple of Amun-Gareb, where pharaohs were crowned and foreign dignitaries paid tribute. Cleopatra herself is believed to have been inaugurated there. The city was referenced by the Greek historian Herodotus and mentioned in various Egyptian inscriptions, but no physical trace had ever been found. By the 8th century AD, all references to Heraklion vanished from the record. It was presumed lost, destroyed, or possibly mythical. Yet here it was, 7 meters beneath the surface of the bay, structurally intact and filled with artifacts that should not have survived. Gaudio's team recovered colossal statues of pharaohs, some over 5 meters tall, carved from red granite and quartzite. These were not fragments, they were complete, unbroken, lying on the seabed as though carefully laid down, rather than toppled by catastrophe. Alongside them were hundreds of smaller statues depicting gods and goddesses, a limestone sphinx, and massive stone blocks inscribed with both Greek and hieroglyphic text. The main temple structure was identified through its foundation stones, which remained aligned despite 2,900 years of tidal movement and seismic activity. Inside and around the temple were 64 ancient ships, their wooden hulls still discernible, and over 700 stone and lead anchors. Gold coins, bronze weights, ceramic vessels, and dozens of sarcophagi were recovered, many still sealed. The preservation was extraordinary. Wood does not survive underwater for over a millennium unless buried in anoxic sediment, yet the ship timbers were intact enough to identify construction techniques. The statues bore no significant erosion, no biofouling, and no coral incrustation. Granite and quartzite are hard stones, but saltwater dissolves surface detail over centuries. The statues from Heraclean retain crisp edges, fine carving, and legible inscriptions. One Egyptologist examining photographs of the recovered pieces remarked, "They look recently submerged." Geological studies indicate that Heraclean sank due to soil liquefaction, a process in which waterlogged sediment loses stability during seismic events. The Nile Delta is prone to such subsidence, and much of the ancient coastline has shifted or disappeared over millennia. What geology does not explain is the organized state of the ruins. If the city had collapsed suddenly due to liquefaction, structures would have buckled, statues would have fragmented, and ships would have been crushed or scattered. Instead, the city appears to have settled vertically, almost gently, with objects remaining in place. Streets are still traceable, building foundations are aligned. The temple precinct is spatially coherent. One marine archaeologist involved in the survey described the site as architecturally calm. Further analysis revealed another anomaly. The sarcophagi recovered from the site were made of limestone and granite, materials that absorb water. After 12 centuries submerged, they should have been saturated, weakened, and cracked. Several were opened on site. Inside, the remains were desiccated, not waterlogged. Bone and textile fragments were dry. One coffin contained a linen shroud that, upon analysis, showed no signs of prolonged water exposure. It had decayed as though kept in a tomb, not submerged in the sea. In 2003, Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities restricted access to the site. Gaudio's team was granted limited permits for continued excavation, but independent researchers were not allowed. Artifacts were transferred to storage in Alexandria, and many have not been publicly displayed. In 2013, plans for an underwater museum at Heraclean were announced but never materialized. The site remains classified, monitored, and largely off-limits. Heraclean was myth until it was found. Now it is real, preserved in a way that makes no physical sense. The city sank, but it did not decay, and no one has explained how. If these stories have changed the way you look at the mysteries hidden beneath the waves, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are uncovering the history they tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds of the future. The next treasure trove will be revealed soon.